steps I'm taking. Cut my heart's desires till I'm living for you, a disciple of truth, full of holy fire that burns with your passion. New right spirit deep in me, set me free, free to live with your passion, living for your will and nothing more, with passion for you,
Sex addiction is best understood as this umbrella term, and there are a lot of different flavors that are underneath. It's the same way we think about alcoholism. We call somebody, you're an alcoholic. Alcoholism is the name of this problem. And we don't differentiate between, well, I'm a wine addict, or I'm a Jack Daniels addict, or, well, I'm a champagne addict. You know, they're alcoholics. And why? Because it's the same dynamics. And I really believe that's the best way to look at this mistermed sex addiction. Here's that relationship addiction that's primary in women, that I'm not okay without a man in my life. I'm going from relationship to relationship, looking for somebody else to make me feel whole. Okay? Her dynamic is really the same as somebody who's interested in just that hit, that rush, that neurochemical high of sex itself. They're both trying to get non-sexual needs met in a sexual way. It's the same dynamic, same problem. What we're understanding now about sex addicts is that we're really drug addicts, meaning sexual thought and sexual activity fires off all these neurochemicals in our brain, all the feel-good chemicals like serotonin and dopamine. It's a huge player in the pleasure center of the brain. Adrenaline, that leap tall buildings at a single bound. And all those chemicals are getting fired off around sexual thought and sexual activity. And so the body will develop tolerance the same way we would with alcohol. It's going to take more and more and more to get the same result. And so literally, a sex addict can become addicted to her own brain chemicals. You know, I don't have to go do anything. I can just call up all these images in my brain, and I'm carrying this constant supply around in my head. So it's a very, very powerful addiction because I don't have to go and do anything else. I can literally just think. They can get triggered from our sexually saturated culture. You can't go to the grocery store and get out without getting bombarded with sexual pictures of standard magazines, you know, Cosmo, but even other standard ladies magazines. Here are all these sexual images. You can't go anywhere without the sexual images. And those things can be trigger enough. Just thoughts. Sexual activity, I think, and sexual thoughts are about medicating. So, meaning, I'm feeling lonely, I'm feeling not good about myself, well, I'll see this guy across the grocery store aisle, and I'll think, you could make me feel better about me if you wanted me. And wanted me means not to get to know my heart as a person. Wanted me means, hey, honey, I think you're cool. You know, I'm sexually attracted to you. Then that would tell me that I'm okay. So just that quick, those thoughts come into our minds. And pornography is particularly addictive. We're coming to understand neurochemically in terms of the internet because it's more interactive. Pornography, as I'm, even just moving the mouse and calling up the images or in the sexual chat rooms, there's something interactive that's different than just looking at it printed on the page. And that feedback loop is extremely, extremely addictive. I think it's why the internet is the crack cocaine of sex addiction. It's the great accelerator. It's the supercharger because of this feedback loop. Recovery has got to be about putting positive things into your life. If our journey away from sexual sin is about all these things I don't do, I'm not going to be successful. Because if it's all about deprivation, that's been largely what our lives are like to start with. As sexual trauma survivors, as people who have been abandoned of healthy love and nurture, I'm already so deprived, and now you tell me I'm going to deprive myself of this one thing that has been my solution to life's problems. I'm not going to do that long term. So instead, you're exactly right. I need that vision of where am I going? You know, what is God's plan for me? What is the ultimate fulfillment? And as I put healthy things back into my life, healthy connections, first with other women, healthy, boundaried, accountable connections with other men, certainly connection, of course, that's first with God. I find that putting those positive things into my life, that's the solution. I've done lots of thinking, and I don't have it all formulated at all yet, about sexuality and spirituality. And it seems to me that it is in our sexuality that we're most connected to our spirituality. Those are most akin. And again, I don't have all the thought, the theology even formulated, but as I think about those things, I think about in sexuality, we are knowing and being known at the most intimate physical level. Well, isn't that the picture of how God wants to know us and know our hearts, and how He wants us to know Him in the spiritual level? I think it's a metaphor for what God wants. I think the idea of opening ourselves to accept something into ourselves. I mean, again, you know, this maybe sounds sacrilegious, but I think that's what God's asking me to do. He's asking me to open my heart and my life and accept His light in. They're just different parallels, I think, in this big global, you know, metaphysical, existential kind of ways that I think God knew what He was doing. Obviously God knew what He was doing, but I think in the best way that sexuality can bring us closest to God. We've perverted it. We only achieve intimacy with God through beginning point with other people. I think we can only experience or come to understand what does it mean to receive God's grace by receiving it from other people. I mean, that's where it starts. I know that the first time that I poured out all this yuck in my life, I was suicidal. My life was totally destroyed. I had cervical cancer caused by a sexually transmitted disease. I knew my life was out of control. I knew I had to stop, and I could not stop. And when finally, just in despair, on my kitchen floor one summer morning, I picked up the phone and I called a girlfriend, and I just vomited out all this yuck in my life. I'm having this affair. It's not my first affair. That's really why I lost my first marriage. Here, this cervical cancer, it's really from an STD. I just poured out all this stuff. And I just expected, you know, for her to judge me and condemn me. And I said, you know, I really want to kill myself. And I don't think I'm really going to do it, but I just want somebody to know why. And she said, I'm so sorry. And I was just astounded. And she said, hang on, I'm coming. I'll get you help. And she did. And she came and she sat in my kitchen floor with me that day. And she helped connect me to a Christian counselor. And that was the first time I experienced grace. And then with that Christian counselor who understood addiction, and I poured out this story to her, and she said the same kinds of things. And she told me, Marnie, God loves you just as much today in the height of this sin as He's ever going to love you when you're not involved in this behavior. And I was like, whoa. And you know what? That made me want to not be involved in the behavior. You know, funny how grace works like that. It didn't make me say, oh, good, well, I'll just keep doing what I'm doing. But as I experienced that kind of grace through other people, I went to my first group for people in recovery from sex addiction, finally, and was so afraid now to tell my story to somebody else besides my therapist, you know, and experience love and grace from them. I began to believe, wow, this is how God works. And these people are showing me a picture of what He's like. And as I became intimate in a healthy way, again with that girlfriend, with a counselor, a group of recovering women, a larger group ultimately of recovering men, and now a community of faith around recovery from sexual abuse and sexual addiction, and experience that intimacy, that's when I most feel God's presence. You know? And it tells me this is what He's like. Our culture is so performance-oriented. I mean, our measuring sticks of success are how many football games does this team win, to how much money does this company make, to how much money does an individual make, you know, how many toys do I have? I mean, all of those measures that are external, I think our culture has created, but I think also our church has done that as well. Because sadly, many of the very rigid, rule-keeping kinds of religious bodies that are after rules and don't understand yet about relationship, then the more rules I keep, and the better I keep them, the better Christian I am, and the more I am acceptable and loved by God. So I get set up in this system of I have got to be good enough or I'm awful. I do think that that's the fear, that if we take away the rules, if we give people too much grace, then they're just going to go do whatever they please. And there's going to be chaos, and there's going to be just rampant sin. And it's just so interesting. I think God knew we're not motivated by guilt. Guilt does not change people. Guilt enslaves people. Guilt makes them feel worse and worse and worse about themselves. I'm talking about unhealthy, I would say toxic shame is a better word than guilt. But motivate with love? Oh, yeah. And that's what God did. I mean, that's the whole point of John 3:16. God called people to Himself through His love of giving His Son. And when I really realize what that is about, and I get that relationship with Him that's not about keeping the rules, it's about something so much deeper and richer, and the more I get of that, the more I want. I mean, that's how God created us, I think, that the more we are so connected to Him and in healthy ways to other people, the more we want that connection. And that takes us into a deeper journey of wholeness and holiness. It's the opposite of what people would think. The shift into grace and relationship only comes through brokenness. I think only when we are broken do I realize all this performance stuff, all this achievement, all these accolades, they still don't fill that yawning black hole inside. And when I realize how empty I am, which usually comes from the brokenness of failure and sin and addiction, depression, when I realize that despite all this great performance, I am so broken and that stuff doesn't work, then God can meet me. A healthy support group first is going to be a safe place. And that means there have to be boundaries. That means they're not unhealthy in the realm of sexual addiction recovery. They're not unhealthy sexual stuff going on between people in the group. There's accountability. But I think also a healthy support group is about the solution, not about the problem. It's really focused on the solution, on this is what works. This is the vision. This is where we want to go. And it's not a dialogue about here's all the bad stuff I've done or all the bad stuff I've done this week. It's focused on the solution. Now for women to find a support group around sex addiction recovery is really, really hard. I know that when I finally was willing to go to a support group, which was almost a year into my own recovery, and when I was finally willing to do that and I walked into my first sex addiction fellowship, a 12-step group, it was me and 20 men. And I couldn't do that. At that point, I was still so new in the journey. In fact, I wasn't yet sexually sober. I was still returning periodically to an adulterous affair, still at that point. And probably the group was safe, but I wasn't safe. Meaning, I was too into, well, what do these guys think of me, and do I look okay? And I was still so much into my sickness. So I went back and I told my Christian counselor, I know I need that. that first hour in that first group, I felt like I was at home. I thought, these people understand me, but I can't do this vehicle yet. And so I did my early 12-step recovery work in a women's-only AA meeting. And it was women, so that was safer. And again, God is just so cool. The first sponsor that I got, in fact, she would still be my sponsor today, recovering alcoholic, woman who had 20 years of alcoholism sobriety at that point. And as I told her my story and said, I know that I'm in recovery from sex addiction, alcohol's not my problem. And I told her my story, and she said, Marnie, I'm a sex addict too. I just didn't know what to call it, but that's been my journey too. And I just thought, isn't God cool? You know, that he connected me with another woman who really understood my particular flavor of addiction. And so in that safety of learning to be intimate with other women, of seeing what a healthy group looked like, after a year or so I could go back to a sex addiction fellowship, and it was still me and 20 men, but I was safer. And that ultimately was really helpful to me to learn in that kind of environment to see men as just men, just other hurting, wounded people on the journey, the same way that I was, and to learn myself not to objectify men, not to expect you're going to be my savior, to learn to have boundaried relationships, and it was very important. But for women to find a support group that is populated with at least some other women, I do think is really, really helpful and probably where they need to start. And sadly, that's very, very hard to find still today. I am so blessed and humbled to direct a ministry called Bethesda Workshops. And Bethesda Workshops is a program, it's not a place. Meaning we're based in Nashville, Tennessee, not in Bethesda, Maryland. And the program, again, grew out of my own journey. I had become associated with Dr. Mark Laser, recovering sex addict, Christian leader in this field, and working through his ministry, ironically, to help wives of male sex addicts in a workshop, a treatment kind of setting. And driving home one Sunday evening from participating as a group leader in one of those workshops for wives, it felt like God spoke to me, and I thought, with God's help, I could do this for women. I mean, women who are struggling themselves. There's nothing out there for women. And within, I think, 4 months, was able to offer the first treatment workshop for female sex addicts, and that was in 1997. And since then, the ministry has grown. Today, Bethesda Workshops encompasses all the populations who struggle with sex addiction, meaning men who personally struggle, women who personally struggle, spouses of those who struggle, and that's 99.9% wives, but there's some husbands who will come to the program, and then couples. So the program is expanded broader now than just for women, but my heart is so much for women who struggle with sex addiction. But Bethesda Workshops, it's called a clinical intensive, meaning it's just 4 days. It's Wednesday afternoon through Sunday afternoon. And the program is held just in a conference hotel in Nashville, Tennessee. But people come to us from all across the country, from Canada, rarely, but occasionally. We've had a couple of people from Europe. And they come, and in that 4.5 days, receive so much information about sex addiction, but especially about the roots of the problem, this intimacy problem, about what is the solution. But I think most importantly, because we are from a Christ-centered faith perspective, I believe that God really meets people there. And they begin, if they haven't already, to experience that different kind of relationship with God. And it also helps people get connected in community. Because again, isolation is such a part of this disease, this sin in our lives. I don't want anybody to know me, so I'm so isolated. And in a group setting, which is so much more powerful than working individually with a counselor, to be in group and receive the grace and the challenge from other group members, then I get hungry for that kind of connection. And so I'm more willing to stretch out of my fear, out of my comfort zone when I get home, and to try to get connected with a group. We've got a real comprehensive website, BethesdaWorkshops.org. Bethesda, B-E-T-H-E-S-D-A, workshops, plural with an S.org.
Hi, I'm Cy Rogers, and I'm going to share some of my thoughts about the issue of sexual struggles in God's family. If you struggle, well, that doesn't make you bad, and it doesn't make God mad at you, but it does make you human and vulnerable. And as I've shared on a previous episode, you know, we do serve a God with a history of sexual redemption. But I want to take a look right now in our time at some of the categories of problems in God's family. In fact, there are 5 of them. According to clinicians, there are 17 categories of sexual deviation. We're not going to go into all of that list, but you could lump it up into probably 5 key areas that I find in my years of pastoral ministry occur again and again and again among God's people. And so, category number 1, I call it the common problems. Common problems such as adultery, where people today are not living by commitment nearly as much as they live by feelings. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to take a look at a soap opera and see the people breed like rabbits. And oftentimes, in spite of commitment, they find themselves attracted and they live by how they feel. And that's very easy to rationalize what you want when you live only by your feelings versus commitments. And of course, certainly it's more than just a black or white issue. There are varying shades of gray that set us up to violate our commitments. And so, adultery is a common problem, even in God's family today. But thank God we serve a God who knows how to address that concern and bring healing and restoration. I know some people who've even gotten divorced who later found the ability to heal and reconcile and go forward in a new season of marriage, having repaired those faulty foundations. Other people, their marriage may burn to the ground, but God can help the individual rebuild life and find purpose in God's family. Then, you know, another problem within the common category, kind of a subset, in addition to adultery, there's the issue of premarital sex. There are many people today getting involved in sex before marriage, and that's true in God's family, where research shows that Christian young people are demonstrating a rate of sexual activity just about equal to the world. Now, being the father of an adult myself, I've had to navigate my own child through all the various risks, and I can empathize with the challenges that face this generation in our media civilization, where when you ask young people in surveys, why are you having sex before marriage, even evangelical young people will often begin to unpack this answer. Something like this will be articulated. Well, you know, we didn't really mean to have intercourse, but on a date we started making out, you know, that touchy-touchy, feely-feely, and one thing kind of led to another, as it always does. And so even though they knew better than to have intercourse, the fact that they thought on a date they were entitled to making out and getting physically intimate apart from intercourse just paved the way to intercourse. In fact, you know, that touchy-touchy, feely-feely we call making out is really what would be defined as something else. Listen to the description. Physically intimate, sexual contact apart from intercourse, the purpose designed to stir you up and turn you on. Now, that's not just making out. That's the working definition for foreplay. And the point of foreplay is to pave the way to go all the way. So what we have are many young people, even Christians, thinking that they're entitled to make out when actually we call it foreplay. And it's no wonder they end up going all the way. Now, if that's you and you've crossed the boundaries and you've gone too far, I just want to encourage you that there's a God who forgives, who is abundant in mercy, and his understanding of our human frailties is clear. And if it's not been clear to you that he can wash you, even if you're not a virgin anymore, even if you went further than you thought, God would like to teach you how to get back in boundaries and regain dignity and self-control, put the past in the past, and move forward with new opportunities today. Also, I find that when a lot of young people get involved in sex out of marriage, they will often say, well, isn't that what you're supposed to do? Isn't that what normal guys and girls do? And that tells me you're listening to world culture, not God culture. And, you know, whenever young people say, well, how far can I go on a date? I'll tell you how far I think you should go. If you can't do it in front of your mommy and daddy, why are you doing it at all? And you know what? Very often they laugh at me because what they think I've said comes from Mars, which goes to show you that they've been brooding the stew of modern culture far more than they've been listening to God and his standards. And so it's true that by the time an American kid's 16, they've probably watched about 11,000 hours of television. That may be different to varying degrees around the world, but it's all true. We drink our brew from that stew of world culture, and we can't deny how it affects us. Kind of like a fish in the water doesn't always know it's wet. We get propelled along by these currents of culture that can lead us down the wrong path. And so if you have found yourself being involved in too much touch outside the boundaries, if you have a history where you've done things that now you realize, I missed the mark, we serve a God, again, who's quick to forgive. Help us to regain dignity and self-control, and maybe you need to work on that and get some accountability. But the bottom line is we serve a God who is merciful and redemptive. And don't let this take you from God. Let it push you to Him, that you can know the assurance of His love, and that He'll take every mistake you've made and make it work for good. And then let's get on a campaign to educate our people a little better, that we can choose better and walk better, and not just mop up a mess, but help prevent it as well. That's my thoughts about that.